extraordinary American. Steve Phillips is a national treasure and an American hero. That's my opinion. He is a political leader, civil rights lawyer, and a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. He's a columnist for The Guardian and The Nation and a regular opinion contributor to the New York Times. He has appeared on multiple national radio and television networks such as NBC, CNN, MSNBC, C-SPAN, and BBC. He's the founder of Democracy in Color, a political media organization focused on political strategy and analysis at the intersection of race and politics. He's also the host of the podcast in the same name, Democracy in Color, with Steve Phillips. He is the author of the 2016 New York Times bestseller, Brown is the New White, How the Demographic Revolution Has Created a New American Majority. His most recent masterpiece is called How We Win the Civil War, Securing a Multiracial Democracy and Ending White Supremacy for Good. This book, so buy it before you leave if you don't win one. At the beginning of the book, and I'm stealing from him, this is a quote from Mr. Phillips. He writes, "To the folks who have done the work, are doing the work, and want to do the work, that's us, that's you. This is a love letter to all of us." He writes, "On behalf of a grateful world, I thank you. On behalf of us, Mr. Phillips, we thank you." Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Phillips.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, I'm delighted to be able to share with you, and I really appreciate the invitation and enjoy the very overly kind introduction. But it's just great to connect and to see the work and the energy that you guys have, and to see the evolution, frankly, of Indivisible. I mean, I have been friends with Leah and Ezra from the time that they started Indivisible. And so to see the work continuing to go on, numbers of people all over the country, and then within these states all the way down into the local areas, is the essential work of what actually has to happen in this country. And so I'm just delighted that you guys are doing what you're doing. And I meant what I said in the book, that I spent 2 years of my life really trying to lay out an analysis and understanding of where we're at and what we have to do, actually as a love letter to all of you doing the work. And so I am delighted to be with you. So let me just say a couple things around this. So first of all, your work is critically important in that you absolutely can put Florida back in play. So I want to open and clarify that with you from the beginning, to be able to carry that. You certainly wouldn't know that from reading the national media and the national news and whatnot. So this election is critically important, and it is literally an existential election, in that we are at this point of battling out, what is this nation? Are we a primarily white country, or are we a multiracial democracy, and where should we actually be going? And I say in the introduction to the current book that I think this is an 1876 moment, that was the time period after the Civil War and after Reconstruction, which was one of the few times where you had national consensus, or at least national majority, moving towards making this country a multiracial democracy, having its institutions, having its society work for everybody from all backgrounds. And even that was met with great resistance. But we had made significant progress, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, civil rights laws, education, healthcare, expanding the concept of what this country should actually be. And then we faced an election in 1876 around, should we continue on that path, or should we go backwards and essentially hand the country back to the slave owners, which is in fact what that election came down to. And that is in fact how the election played itself out. Closely fought election. The losing side, the Confederates, conceded the White House so that they could actually have white people put back in power across the South, and and that happened and reinstituted, essentially legalized white supremacy for almost 100 years throughout the South, which means within this country. So that struggle is still what's actually going on today. And that what I think it is critically essential for us to understand that we are literally in not only in an existential moment, but that the Confederates have never stopped fighting. And that I had thought about this, and I'll put this together in my book originally, really more metaphorically. The country was so divided and so much, hate, et cetera, that let's look at Civil War as a metaphor. Everybody obviously knows that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, but I didn't know myself exactly when and exactly why he was assassinated. And so the surrender at Appomattox took place on a Sunday. 2 days later, on Tuesday, Lincoln gave a speech from the White House talking about limited suffrage for African Americans in Louisiana. John Wilkes, it was a speech he gave to the public outside the White House. John Wilkes Booth was there, turned to somebody next to him, said, "That means N-word citizenship. That is the last speech he will ever give." Friday of that same week, John Wilkes Booth goes into Ford Theater and shoots Lincoln in the back of the head. That's not surrender. The Confederates have never stopped fighting from that very first week where they supposedly had surrendered. Moving up to 1876, as I was talking about, those are the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. They really grappled with, and it is notable that it was Senator John Brown Gordon from Georgia who was the person who brokered the compromise that gave the South back the control. And I think it is notable to know that with the arc of history, that seat is now held by Raphael Warnock, and the person who had done that. So in terms of where the arc of history goes and how these different things move forward. But the Hayes-Tilden Compromise did in fact reinstitute legalized white supremacy in this country for nearly 100 years. And so this concept, is this a white country? Is this a multiracial country? Is this a country for straight white men in particular? And that is something we have seen with ferocity in Florida. If there's anybody who embodies the modern day continuity of the fight of the Confederacy, it's Ron DeSantis, and how he has leaned so heavily into embracing and celebrating the notion that this country is only for straight white men, and everybody else at the minimum should be pushed to the side, if not actually oppressed and have their rights stripped from them. So that is what is at stake here. The good news is that the majority of people in this country and the majority of people in Florida believe that this should be a multiracial nation. And so we are, in fact, and particularly you in Florida, are in fact living under minority rule. And that's why they have to so ferociously suppress the vote. And they have to be so consciously trying to make sure nothing is done to expand democracy to make it easier for people to actually participate in elections. And so you saw it in Florida, you've seen it in Texas where I am now, you've seen it in other places across the South, seen it in Georgia, I was even in the Larry Davis Curb Your Enthusiasm show where he gets arrested for trying to give someone water, which was satire of the actual law that had been passed to try to make it harder for people to vote. And the reason they want to make it harder for people to vote is because they know that they do not have majority support. And so that should be a strong signal to us around what we actually need to do going forward. So let me say a few things just to put your work and what you're doing there today and in this year in some context as we think about charting the way forward. And these are a couple of things that are critical to remember because it's often there's been a lot of defeats and a lot of difficulties and a lot of challenges and obstacles that we have faced. The first thing to remember is that Barack Obama won Florida in 2008. So we have to hold that in our memories. Barack Obama won Florida in 2012. You have to remember that, hold that in our memories. And then most lost to history. And then really, frankly, in terms of one of the great, both personal and social change and political tragedies of our country was Andrew Gillum lost by just 30,000 votes, 0.4% in 2018, which would have, for one, kept Ron DeSantis out of the position where he has actually gone towards, to say nothing of putting someone like Andrew into position as governor, having the first African-American governor. So if that is in fact core reality of Florida's history, and yet we face all these challenges today, in the past several years, there have been so many different setbacks and obstacles. What happened? How do we understand that? And what are the implications for that and where we actually go forward? What do we actually need to do going forward? Somebody said to me in 2019, after the gubernatorial elections, well, we keep losing by close margins in Florida, but that didn't really appreciate and understand the trajectory of what had unfolded. Is that Andrew in 2018 almost doubled the number of votes, of Democratic votes. And so it's not just that like, oh, there was a close race 2014, we got almost twice as many votes in 2018. And it was still close. So that is something we have to dig into and understand more carefully. And so what has happened fundamentally in Florida over the past decade is that the conservative and right-wing infrequent voters have come out of the woodwork, and we have not kept pace in terms of bringing our voters out in terms of voter mobilization. And that's the fundamental reality of what we have been facing, right? They have sent out a bat signal to the batshit crazy modern day Confederates to come and defend their concept of America as a white country. And they have turned out. And yet we have not responded by bringing our voters out in commensurate numbers. And then we have continued to try the strategy of trying to appeal to the conservative and Republican voters, even to the extent of nominating the former Republican governor as our supposed savior, as a way to win back that smaller sliver of the electorate. So let me just try to illustrate that for you. Bear with me as I move to my limits of my tech capacity here. But I'm going to try to share with you this slide around the, everyone see that slide there? So you will see in this, what has happened is the increase, this slide, in time, second here, is the increase in the vote over the past decade, is that the number of people voting has gone up dramatically. And yet you'll see with the red bar there that the Republican vote has gone up more. And so the Democrat vote has gone up, but it hasn't gone up as much. So that's the fundamental dynamic and reality of what has been transpiring in Florida over the past decade. And that lays out what the imperative is for what we have to do in terms of moving forward. And so fundamentally is about what you're talking about, is doing the work, the fundamental blocking and tackling, the often unsexy work of door knocking and calling and following up with people and making sure people actually turn out to vote. But I think it's critical to appreciate that. And the reason I wanted to start with understanding the Obama election to today is that there are more people on our side than on their side. And if you look at even the composition then of Florida overall, that the state is 41% people of color, but the voting population does not fully reflect that. So whites are overrepresented in terms of who actually turns out at the polls. And Latinos are significantly underrepresented, and African Americans somewhat slightly underrepresented. So that is the fundamental strategic imperative and reality of what we're facing. And so that really lays out what the path is in terms of where we need to go, what we need to do. Biden lost Florida by 371,000 votes in 2020. There were nearly 3 million people of color who did not vote in 2020. And so that, again, shows the path and the direction in terms of where we actually need to go. And it's also, let me just make this point as well, so it's also critically important to understand and appreciate. So when I talk about the new American majority and the composition of what the electorate looks like, that does include progressive whites. And we often skip over that and don't appreciate that. But throughout the history of this country, there have always been whites who have stood for and advocated for and fought for this country to be a multiracial democracy, right? Thomas Jefferson, as complicated as his own history was, tried to put into the Declaration of Independence a condemnation of the slave trade. The white Southern slaveholders made him actually take that out. So that struggle has taken place. All of the progress that was made and all of the progressive legislation of the Reconstruction era, of the post-Civil War battle, expanding education, healthcare, providing some level of economic support, and all of that was driven by progressive whites, the radical Republicans of the 1860s. That's a tradition that I think it's important to validate and understand. And then in terms of moving it, transferring it to the current electoral realm, there's also a lot of non-voting progressive whites. There's a lot of attention to, a lot of the media likes to focus on, Trump voters in diners, usually in the Midwest. And it's like, well, how do we get those people back and trying to change their minds and whatnot? And that what Mike Podars, who worked with the AFL-CIO political director, has pointed out is that there's a different way of looking at that. And if we pull back the lens and not just focus in on that, truck driver in the diner, but who's the waitress pouring the coffee for that person? And what's going on with the attacks on her reproductive rights in terms of her ability to have, bodily autonomy in her own economic situation? That person is far more likely to be supportive and progressive with us, and supportive of us. So that's a way of thinking about. Also, some of the work is about identifying and mobilizing and attracting progressive whites as well, particularly infrequent voting progressive whites. So that's another core component of all of this work. And then the other thing I'll say, and then we can have question and answers if you at the end of this, is that the trend is also in our direction. And so that's another key critical thing to realize, that if you look at voting, and I think that that's some of the stuff which you guys are going to be grappling with and exploring throughout the course of this day, is that young people in Florida have voted in a far more progressive fashion. 60% of young people voted for Biden. And so that's a population. Then if you look at the under 18 population, that's majority people of color. And so lots of people are turning 18 and becoming eligible voters every day. So that's another whole pool and population of people who could be brought into onto our side. And if we can continue to engage and support and organize and unleash those folks and their energy, that's a trend that's actually with us in our direction. So like, what are we doing in that regard? That it's not inconceivable, or frankly, I would think that difficult to actually accomplish, frankly. And then Jesse Jackson used to talk about every high school senior should receive a diploma in one hand and a voter registration card in the other. So what are we doing to make sure every single person that we can potentially, who's a young person, who's coming into adulthood, is being engaged and inspired and empowered to be able to move forward and participate and make their voices heard as we move actually forward. And so this is also a challenge. The other thing, I guess the last thing I do want to leave with you in this concept is that not only is there a majority that is supportive of a multiracial democracy, but the majority actually supports the policy vision. And that I can't emphasize enough how much of a minority agenda DeSantis has been driving within Florida. And you see it in terms of the Supreme Court and how everyone's trying to backtrack around the whole attacks on reproductive rights. And that they're seeing that they're losing in places that progressives didn't used to win, Kansas and Ohio, as they have gone far too far on this regard. Republicans in Arizona are now trying to say, oh no, we're not for that level of ban, which of course they are and have been, but they see that they've overreached and that they are now trying to potentially suffer the consequences of advancing a minority agenda. So that's the last thing I would say. Is you go out and do your work, as you engage with these different communities, as you try to bring people into the electorate, is that a big part of the work is also inspiring and engaging and challenging people to embrace and celebrate a just and inclusive vision of what this country and what this society should actually be, and to lean into and fight back on the things that DeSantis has been trying to advance within. So all of these book bans. So we could be doing, I think we should be doing, showing up at like high schools and doing book giveaways of the books that they're banning, and then to do that in ways that dramatize and draw attention to that there is opposition and there's a different vision of what the society should actually be. That's a way to attract these different types of voters. But we can actually, DeSantis and the legislature driving this, trying to, not have any, don't say gay bill, this type of a thing. We could be having don't say gay, we could having gay, we say gay conferences and gatherings where we celebrate again the humanity of the diversity of people. And so leaning into and embracing the things that they are attacking is not only the right thing to do, but it's actually going to be the effective thing to do. Because a big part of the work, the reason the electorate does not reflect the actual population is that there's not enough inspiration and motivation and enthusiasm. And I think we should be tapping into the values that people want to see manifested, highlighting for them that there is strong opposition and we have to defeat the opposition who is against that. And then even if people on our side are not as championed and as much as we want or as valuable or as aggressive a run as we want, being clear though of the opposition and the attacks that are coming. And then if we want there to be stronger positions and further pushing, let's challenge and engage people to provide that ourselves. Let's defeat the opposition in 2024. And then in 2025, let's recruit people to run on the full platform with the full agenda of what we actually want to see. And so that's what I would commend to you, and I want to leave with you, is that that is not only, I believe, the right thing to do, but it's very clear to me that the numbers show that that's also a winning strategy. And so that's what I wanted to share with you, and I just want to thank you for the invitation, and more fundamentally, thank you for the work that you are doing to try to bring this things forward, because it is absolutely the case that the numbers are there in Florida. And if you want to really shock the nation, let's put Florida in play, and that will upend and do a great service to the entire progressive movement in this country. So thank you for what you guys are doing. Thank you for inviting me. And then if you want to have some Q&A, I'm happy to do that as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Phillips. That was exciting, and it gives me hope. We all need that, right? So I hope you have time for a few questions. We had quite a few submitted prior to tonight, and I'm going to consolidate. But the first subject is one that you just brought up, youth. And we have a whole table of folks here who are especially interested in the youth vote. So combining a few of these, I'm going to read a few comments here that young people aren't focused on the civil rights era like those born prior to 1965. How do we get them, fired up? Please consider recent studies of the socializations of HBCU students and their ideas about voting when they don't see a clear benefit to it. Are there any tried and true successful methods or models for getting young people out to vote? And have they ever been asked what would make them vote? And how do we, quote, sell the down ballot ticket for Dems to the young voters? So I know you've already spoken a bit towards this, but could you address some of those specific questions?
Yeah, no, those are all great questions. Just on that first point, I don't think we have to, I think there's, inspiration to draw from. There's different cultural arts and entertainment people could look to in terms of better understanding the civil rights era itself, with Rustin, the movie, a Netflix film that was out. So that's ways that you can connect. I don't think in Florida that we need to. You guys are engaged in a civil rights battle right now. There is an unrelenting assault by the governor and the legislature allied with him and all the people who want to move in this direction around rolling back any policies or direction that would expand the conception of who should be benefited in this society beyond a very limited slice of straight white men in particular. Everybody else has been coming under attack in various ways within the state of Florida. And so that's something to clarify for young people, that the civil rights struggle in Florida is right now. So that's the first thing that I would say on that front. And then there's a question around how to communicate to people around what are the current pieces. So for one is that there has been more done than people realize, that I do think we should give credit to in terms of this administration and the members of Congress. The administration has been very aggressive around fighting the fight, certainly around student debt, and really trying to be able to forgive student debt. And that would encourage us to push that even farther around the question that I remember this was like a long time ago, I was watching when Dennis Kucinich was running for president. And I was like walking around, I was listening to the debate or something. And he said, I hear him say something about this, college should be free. And then I like stopped and I'm like, college should be free, right? In terms of like, if our values as a society, what do we think is actually important? And so lifting, which direction do we want to be able to move in this country? And so the administration has done work on that regard, and they should get credit for that. And young people should know that one of the sides in this election has been fighting for better conditions for young people to be able to relieve that debt so that they could have more opportunities in terms of moving forward within the society. And then just the last piece I would say is also, I think this issue around encouraging and challenging people to act. And so it's both in terms of we have to be clear-eyed and aggressive in turning out in large numbers in this particular election with what the specific choices are. But that doesn't limit the totality of what we can do. And so oftentimes, and that's one of the best values of the best roles that young people play, is lifting up a higher, more idealistic, more ambitious agenda for what society should be. And we should absolutely be doing that. And then encouraging people to run for local office, run for school board, run for state legislature on that platform that embodies their fullest, highest ambitions and ideals. And that's ways to further get people to be more engaged and to draw those connections. It's not just an issue around what is the choice between the two people running for president, but what's the society we want and what's each of ours role in terms of trying to advance that and move that forward.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I know a lot of these questions, if y'all haven't read Brown is the New White, highly recommend it. I'm excited about reading your next book, but I wanted to get a signed copy, so I haven't read it yet. The next question of the three questions, the second one is on the Black, Indigenous, people of color, the BIPOC population, which we have actually the most folks here. Little hand, go ahead, applaud for yourself, you BIPOC tables. Wonderful. So I'm going to try to synthesize this again in the interest of time. One of the things is, how can we motivate persons in fragile neighborhoods who express no desire to vote? How can white allies best support and lift up voices for our democratic future? And sorry, I keep hearing about distrust of whites within the Black community, and that is certainly very well earned. But what is the best way to get beyond and through that?
Well, let me take maybe the second question first, is that I do, in terms of what some of the roles of progressive whites can do, is that one of the most critical roles is to support and champion and advance the work of leaders of color and groups of color. And so this whole piece around trying to become like an ambassador and a champion and somebody who's invested in an ongoing basis around who is trying to advance this work, both in terms of statewide level and even locally, is that there's somebody that you can, I did a conversation around this. I was saying that there's I think in terms of 3 steps that each individual can do. And so one is make a list, a list of even just if it's 5 people or 10 or 50 people, or your colleagues, your friends, people who would look to you or listen to you and support what you do. Second is pick an area, and I would say in the context of a state like Florida, what county or city do you want to actually become knowledgeable about and share information about. And then third is become a champion of a leader of color there who is doing civic engagement work in particular. Sign up for their mailing list, give small contributions to them, follow them, and then tell them about the people on your list. And so that, I think, is a critical component of how the ecosystem works in ways to move some of these pieces forward. And now you guys have a lot of different, allies that you work with and a lot of great folks there in the room. I do think that the work at Florida Rising and Andrea Mercado have been doing around trying to advance this concept of voter mobilization and making the electorate look like the population overall is a critical piece. So that gets to this around how do you get people who are uninspired and whose lives are such that they don't see the point. A lot of that is going to be personal contact from trusted messengers. And so being able to find groups and networks who have relationships and reach and staff and volunteers in those communities who can then tell the person next to them, yes, I know things aren't perfect, and yes, I know what you're hearing, but here's what the stakes are. Here's where things are moving forward, and it actually is important. So that's work, but that message comes through most clearly when it's from somebody from that community, and being able, and oftentimes those organizations and those groups and those leaders don't have the kind of support, championing, and backing that they need. So that, and I talk in this current book about both strong civic engagement organizations as well as level 5 leaders. And so finding, backing, and embracing and championing those kinds of leaders at every different level is a very critically underappreciated point. I've told this story about, I connected Stacey Abrams with women in New York, white women in New York, Carol Tolan, who was a donor and an activist who had a small scholarship program in Georgia. And she invested in Stacey's work in Georgia. And she also supported Stacey. So even when Stacey lost in 2018, Carol sent Stacey flowers every week for a year, just to let her know she was there for her, she supported her, she was backing her. So that, I think, is one of the most critical components, is finding, backing, and supporting and championing those leaders.
Thank you. Great points. Great points. And final question, because we're just about out of time, which is sort of the purpose of this summit. How do we leverage the multitude of our liberal progressive social media groups with reliable one voice information and calls to action? And I would expand social media groups to just groups. We are many, 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 many different groups. I think it's what's beautiful about us, but it also makes some logistical challenges, I would say. And then, as my good friend Ingrid said, adding to this question, how to bring the fire.
Well, you guys are already doing that in terms of, bringing the fire in that regard. So I would commend to people, and there's a lot of different efforts people are doing in terms of the communications and the messaging, et cetera. So it's kind of actually a more vast ecosystem, but I think I can fully even just convey exactly in that regard. But I would commend actually to people, because usually it's like we don't pay any attention to what goes on, in the administration or in the White House. Those are just the bureaucrats that don't actually get it. But there is a real inspiring and important, both rising star and risen and social justice, racial justice champion in the White House. So this is Emmy Ruiz, who runs the White House's Office of Political Strategy and Outreach. And she sends out emails on a weekly basis about the work of what the administration is doing from the standpoint with the lens of she was a Latina immigrant from Texas who did great work in places like Colorado and Nevada, and there's a long track record and history of fighting for justice and equality in this country and caring about those people and bringing that voice to the White House and pushing the administration in the right direction on those types of things. So I would encourage people to subscribe to Emmy's email and get her regular email and then share that out. And that's one way of having clear, accurate, objective information that is true information about what is actually happening and what is happening from a progressive standpoint. So that's, I think, the one tangible suggestion I can leave you on that front.
Fabulous. Well, again, Mr. Phillips, we are just so honored to have you here. Can we get another round of applause for Mr. Phillips? Thank you.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you for having me. And I gotta say, thank you most significantly for the work that you're doing. It's vitally needed and I really appreciate it. And I think you have much more potential for impact than you may read in the newspaper. So keep your head down and keep doing the work.
Amen. Thanks again.
Okay, take care, everybody.